Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Finding Financial Fitness Show. I'm your host, Nino Gonzalez, joined again by my co-host, Pei. Pei, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. I had a little bit of a surprise today. I'm having my pool done and I have my sprinkler redone while it's part of the contract and stuff. And they texted me, they're like, "Hey, did you know that the way that your lawn and sprinkler system was built, you're actually watering your neighbor's yards too?"
Oh my.
Yeah. So and I was like, "What, are you kidding me?" Like, yeah, they're like, "Oh, the control is on your house. However, when the sprinkler system is turned on, the neighbor's yard's being watered." So
Wow.
yeah, bigger
Are you
problem
paying
than
for
we
their
thought.
water?
I've been paying for their green lawn
Nice.
all this time.
God, nice.
So
That's
lovely
funny.
news.
It's funny you mentioned that because we were just talking beforehand about what we're going to talk about today being kind of problems, right? There's a lot of bad news going on, both in the media, but both kind of on we have friends, we have family, we have people who are just kind of, there seems to be a negativity vibe going around, like a negativity virus, I feel. So what we really wanted to discuss today was just problems in general in terms of when something goes wrong, and naturally it will in the investment world. And how do you then bring that up to your family, your friends, the people that are hoping you're doing well and want you to succeed, but when there's egg on your face, you almost get that natural feeling of being embarrassed, and understandably so. I can fully relate to that. So we wanted to kind of have those conversations because it's good to know that not if something happens, but when. And it might be as simple as, hey, you lost 0.5% on your portfolio, or as big as an investment went sideways and you're never getting any return on that money. I think it's so important to start from the beginning as opposed to being reactive, it's being proactive. And something I wanted to start with, I wanted to get your take on it, is when we start this journey of investing, both as individuals and people in our lives that are starting, because it's so counter the norm, if you will. I feel like that makes it so much harder for people to share it with their spouses because they're learning about it for the first time, be it the infinite banking concept, be it the income snowball, be it just anything anti-establishment, anti-401k, anti whatever the norm is. So I personally think it's so important to get your significant other involved early on. But what do you think when, I know you and Mike are kind of on the same page a lot when it comes to this, but if you're learning about all of this and you're bringing this to your spouse, what do you think is the best way to bring it to their attention? Do you tell them all these crazy things and all these crazy ideas, or do you more just kind of plant the seed and say, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit about your relationship. Obviously, each individual relationship is different, but if you guys are together on the journey, that's obviously the best choice because then you guys made the decision to get in on the investment together. You guys are kind of lockstep all the way, right? Along the way. So you saw the wins together, and then so now when there's some losses, you're able to kind of just like, hey, we're not going to win 100% of the time, so it's okay. Now, if you're on this journey alone, that's the challenge, right? So we can kind of bring it even down a little bit further, right? So with just a spouse, when you're on this journey alone, you have to you have to first give some wins along the way, right? Celebrate those wins along the way. But when there's something that kind of goes south, I think, ultimately in the end of the day, you have to be honest with the whole situation. It might not be day one when the thing happened, you be honest, but like you gotta present the problem with a solution. That's a big takeaway for me over the years. When you just kind of trauma or problem dump on people and not provide steps of what you have already done, what you have already researched, what are some of the options or choices that you are going to be taking, then at least the person who's receiving the bad news kind of feel like, okay, well, you have already kind of taken steps to do something. These are things that are within our control. It kind of boils down to control, right? You lost control, and now you have kind of a plan that you've kind of either consulted with your coach or advisor or other people, and you come up with a rescue plan, then it's easier for the other person to kind of get on board and say like, okay, not happy about the thing that didn't go so well, but at least you're taking some steps. You're not just dumping the problem on my lap and then saying like, hey, I washed my hand, and kind of start blaming. Then the blame game starts, right? That's the last thing we want to do. Because on the investment journey, it's already lonely enough, right? So you really want to bring the spouse or your significant other with you as much as possible. And so we've always just said, like, if your spouse is not with you on this, already you have a challenge. But if they are at least open to listening, report the good, but warn them against the bad from the beginning. Like, hey, investment is risk, right? So they got to be okay with it. And they got to feel there's got to be a level of trust that you have to build along the way. And a lot of people that we know are early in this stage. And so that trust, it takes time to build. But I think if you're able to kind of swallow your pride and just say like, yeah, that wasn't the best of choice, but these are the lessons I've learned, right? And kind of set that stage. And then if you expand beyond the family, and you were talking about how like when we start this journey, we're alone, right? We don't automatically find a lot of people who are doing the same thing. And if you don't have that community support, then be nice along the way. Like, you don't have to, if somebody question, your choice, like let's say you're doing IBC and then people are like, okay, what is that? That's a scam. You shouldn't do that, blah, blah. You don't need to get into an argument with them, right? Because then what they're going to turn that into is like, wait and see. They want to wait and see you fail. And you don't want that situation, right? So yeah, a lot of things kind of course, for us, hindsight is 2020, right? We are now just kind of dissecting what's happened and how, if these type of things were to happen again in the future, how would I approach it going forward, right? I want to make sure that I'm going to treat my people around me nicely so that when I do fail, I have a cushion. I have a community to fall back on. I have people who are going to be supportive, and I have people who are going to be like, hey, it's okay, right? We see that when you're successful, you treated us well and you treat us with respect, and you're not boasting your success, right? You're being like nice about it. And then if something does happen, you get a little bit less of the, I
wanted you to fail. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. You know what I mean? Like, that's just human nature.
Well, I think it's very well said. And I think a lot of it starts in the beginning, which is why I wanted to start there, is because yes, it all depends on your relationship. I think communication, and we're talking relationships here, both with your significant other, but also with your friends. I think having an open conversation early on about what you're doing and about the journey that you're going on, I think gives the other person, and specifically your spouse here, some idea of what it is you're doing. And part two to that is it makes you have to learn and understand what it is that you're doing. Because as a teacher, I'm sure you can appreciate this. You don't fully know something until you can teach it to somebody else. And so sometimes, although I think the best thing is always to have a partner like you and Mike who are on similar wavelengths and have similar interests, as opposed to having one person, and this is in the case of with most investment kind of dynamics, you have one person taking the lead and the other spouse being the one that kind of tags along, if you will, doesn't really take as much role into it. But in that second dynamic, it's so important that the person taking that role is able to explain it, because when there is doubts, which naturally will come up from the spouse, then you're able to explain it with such confidence that you know what you're talking about. And I'll give you an example here. If you you pick up the book, Becoming Your Own Banker by Nelson Nash, and you read it first time through, like most people, you're going to say, I'm good. I'm doing life insurance. That's it. Found the key. And then you go tell your spouse, hey, we're going to take money out of our 401k, because Nelson Nash said, we're going to take money from here. We're going to stop contributing here, and we're going to put all of our money into a life insurance policy. Chances are your spouse is going to look at you like you're crazy, and rightfully so, because if you have no idea about how to use life insurance for the infinite banking concept, then you would think this is crazy. And again, that's totally understandable. So you first read the book, then you would read it again, you would ask questions, you would do your own research, you would maybe even set up a conversation with somebody first, a coach, to learn more about it. Then you could bring it to the spouse and say, hey, here's step by step what we're going to do. Because you got to be realistic that oftentimes the spouse isn't going to want to read the same book, isn't going to want to listen to the same podcast, because it doesn't genuinely interest them. But when you, as you mentioned, you almost give a reward and these mini rewards every now and then, you realize, and you make them realize, look at the success of what we're doing, right? And then they can see and reap those benefits. But along the way, you're consistently reminding, not playing devil's advocate like this can all go away, but understanding that there is risk involved. And when you know that person, which you should know, your significant other, their risk tolerance, you can make sure you're not doing something that would put them at risk. If you have a very aggressive investment strategy and they don't want to lose money because they come from a background of, hide money under your couch, you can't just gamble their money and not tell them and hope for the best. Yeah, you might want the best life for them, but ultimately you can ruin your relationship as a result if you're not very careful. That's why open communication is so key. So that once all of that is addressed, hopefully you've built up the fundamentals, the building blocks with your significant other, that if and when something does happen, you can communicate that.
Right. And actually, when you really think about, if you're the person, even this could be friend, this could be your spouse, this could be an eye-opening experience for both parties, right? So a lot of times through hardship, that's when the true character actually shows, right? In a sense, like if you find out that your partner is just not able to handle this type of situation, then you need to look at yourself and say like, okay, then am I going to do that to the person again? Right? You obviously, hopefully,
you said the next person.
Not the next person. Am I going to do this again? Right? To the person who I know, is going to have like a complete heart attack, moment and can't recover from this. So, we don't know how people are going to react. We can only just present that information in the best light possible. And then of course, if your spouse didn't know that you did this, right? You took their savings and didn't tell them, and you just invested the whole thing or a chunk of it, and then you lost it. Obviously, you got to come clean. Eventually, you have to let them know, because it festers, right? But their reaction is a good indication. Like, of course, ask for forgiveness, and hopefully your relationship is strong enough that you can get through this. And you have to remind yourself and your family that money is just a means, right? It's not the end of everything. It's not the end goal of everything. Money is just an enabler, enables you to have the lifestyle you want, to have whatever things you want. So it's, of course, not the most ideal situation to lose money in investments, but it's not the end of the world, right? I don't mean to joke about it. Obviously, money is important, but we have to really realize what's more important in life, right? It's the people, it's the relationship. That's more important. So rescue the relationship first, and then how to move forward from that, right? You have to adjust, right? Like then the next time you are tempted to do something that's, a little bit riskier or something new, then make sure that you don't make the same mistakes, right? That you are now like informing the person of what your plans are, having contingency plans in place, the plan A, B, and maybe even a plan C, just in case something does happen, having a more clear vision, roadmap of the plan. I think that's just another way to pivot, right? It's really a challenge when you're the one who's kind of given the responsibility of managing the finances of the household. It's a double-edged sword. You could say like, oh, great, I'm so lucky my spouse doesn't care, or my significant other, they don't care. I can do whatever I want with the money. But is that really true? Because if you lose the money, then it's not true anymore.
When you're assuming the responsibility, presumably you're getting involved because you want to make a better life for you and that person. And that person trusts you enough to be able to say, I trust your judgment and I trust what you're going to do. And something that came to mind just as you were mentioning this right now, your spouse and your significant other, and even if you don't have a spouse or significant other, even your closest friends, they will know who you really are. And something that I've personally learned is when we're doing this and we're so entrenched in this world and we're looking at the numbers, we're looking at rate of return, we kind of miss the obvious things, really. And when you can talk to somebody and pitch them all of the facts, not your opinion, not your interpretation, but pitch them all of the facts, they can make an opinion. They can form their own opinion based on how they know you. They can say, this investment doesn't seem to fit your personality. Why do you like it so much? Like, why? I've never known you to be somebody who would invest in something like this. Then they may ask a question, are you just doing it because of the return? Are you so blinded by everything else that you're just looking at the rate of return and that's all you're focused in on? Because that could be a red flag. And it's questions like that that you as an individual may not have ever thought about asking. But because your significant other knows you so well and they know your personality traits, they're able to say, this isn't like you. And then they can ask you one more step. They will just ask you why one more time, even though you've asked yourself why multiple times. Hearing it from somebody else makes the question a little bit different. And I think that that's where it's so important to have a team around you. We talked about in a previous episode about building your team. And I think one of the most important pieces to that team is somebody who can be direct with you, who can be blunt with you, who can be honest with you without you internalizing it and with you being able to understand, oh, this person knows me, and take that judgment. I think that that's really impactful so that when the time does come that something does happen, then they've already been involved in the first decision. And you felt like, thank you for your opinion. And I think I'm comfortable doing this. But if you're not comfortable, then we won't do it. I think making a decision as a team, ultimately, even though you as the primary kind of money manager of the household, even though you know more of the technicalities, it's still both of your money, and you're doing it, and they're letting you do it in the hopes of a better life.
Right. And also if your spouse is really scared or hesitant, then, this is one thing that we've learned throughout the year or so that we've been really, really heavily involved in investing is if it's a really, truly good deal, it will be around. So you don't necessarily need to go all in, right? When something is really good and they say it's a time limited opportunity, that's another red flag. So when your spouse is almost like a good, how do you say it? Like a good person to your first line of defense, right? If your spouse is like, oh, I'm not sure, this sounds really sketchy or whatever, but you are still gung-ho about doing it, maybe scale back and say like, how about we compromise and we do half of it? Right. Scale back. That's almost like it's like a blessing in disguise sometimes when you have someone who's like really, really just doesn't have a good feeling about it. I know you trust Yesenia's like gut feeling or read on people a lot, right? And so in a sense, it's kind of saved our butts a couple times because of her intuition. And sometimes if you know this person well and you trust their intuition, and of all the things that you told them, they're like, yeah, go ahead, whatever. But this one, they're just going like, I'm not sure, or like, I don't see why you really want to do this. Then it's kind of like you have to be able to read that sign and say, maybe it's the universe telling you not to do it, right? If you're trying to force it too hard, if you're trying to get this borrow money in order to make the deal happen, and you're just having a lot of roadblocks to get it going. I know that when I used to buy real estate, that was like one of the rules that I follow. If I'm trying to get this piece of property and like the appraisal comes back wrong and the loan officer is just having issues and whatever, right? The survey comes back incorrect, and I'm just feeling like, why is there so much resistance? I usually actually just cancel. I would just walk away from the deal because I see it as a sign that it wasn't meant to be. If it has to be that hard for it to happen, and I'm trying to be overly creative to make it happen, then maybe it's the universe telling me, don't do it. Something wrong with this thing. There was an investment that I really wanted to get into. And so I was trying to get, some fancy, business loans for it. I think I tried 3 times, and then even try like a home equity. Like, can I get a home equity line of credit? And every time I try, just something happens and I can't get the loan. Right. But I think by the 3rd time, I'm like, you know what? I gave it all. I gave it all that I could, and it still doesn't happen. Then it's not meant to be. I'm okay. I'm going to walk away, from that. So I think it's fine, because there's opportunities everywhere, right? You don't have to be fixated on just one.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is as you were speaking, the kind of the 2 questions I was thinking about was, you have to ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen if you can't fund that particular investment? And simultaneously ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen if you lose all that money in that investment? And the gap between those 2 worst possibilities needs to be as slim as possible. Because if there's a huge gap, if you're saying that the worst thing that could happen if you can't fund the investment, let's say you're $10,000 and you can't fund that one. What's the worst thing that can happen? All right, maybe that was paying 100% return in a year. All right, yeah, maybe at the time that you're analyzing, the next best thing is only paying, I say only, but it's only paying 10%. So you're talking about a 90%, I'm using a complete worst case scenario here, and you're talking about a 90% difference. Well, that's a big, big drop. All right. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen if you put that 10,000 into that 90,000 or 100% return in a year and you lose that 10,000? Well, then what happens? You look back on it and you realize, man, I sure wish I would have taken that 10% on that 10,000 as opposed to going for that 100. Because what's the one thing, and you and I, what I'm about to say right now, you and I can both relate to this. What's the one thing that we say when we're anticipating an investment to go bust? Man, I just hope I can get 50% of my principal back. Right? We're not even thinking about the rate of return. We just want some of our money back. And so if you can ask yourself that question about what's the worst thing that can happen, I promise you, if you're getting into this game, and it does feel like a game sometimes, of investing, I promise you there will always be other opportunities. And that's why it's something that I talked to you about, which I'm excited because we're going to have your husband Mike on pretty soon to talk about dibs and using infinite banking concept as an investment. Get into that later. But for me, it's like having that fail safe, having that gold mine, that if you can compare everything and anything to that investment, that's my kind of gold standard. If it doesn't meet certain criteria to that, if you know, all right, it's not as safe, but the return is so worth it. We talk about barbell investing, right? You mentioned this to me, Nate Scott from Dollars and Nonsense. Actually, he picked this from the Black Swan book. I forgot the name of it, but it's essentially talking about 2 sides of investing. You either go for the ultra conservative, safest thing, the closest thing to guaranteed, which in our world would be IBC. So whole dividend paying whole life insurance, or you're going for something that you have a lot of control over, that's going to be life changing, and you ignore everything in the middle. The things that are going to bring you 20, 25, 30% annualized returns, which sound good, but on paper, you absolutely have no control, which is, I know, where you and I spent a lot of our time in the last, prior to this past 18 months, probably 18 months in that space. You learn that that's where a lot can be made, but a lot can sure as hell be lost. Right. And so sticking on those 2 sides, I think is so important, and it helps to balance things out. And going back to what I mentioned, it gives you that once you have that gold standard, it takes a lot of mental stress off of your plate, thinking about all these what ifs.
Yeah. And I think, it's, we're taught to chase after rate. That's just the way, when you think about investment, what is the golden measurement for a good investment? They never talk about, anything else but the rate. Everybody's always just comparing on the rate, right? It's almost like, you're talking about what's a good spouse, and they only just talk about, well, a good spouse brings home a lot of money. It's a lot more than that, right? Or a good spouse can cook a good meal. That's important if you care about it only goes so far, right? So it's multifaceted. There's a lot of layers to it. But if you are getting into the investing world or have some experience already and looking to take it to the next level, right? The rate of return is not enough. And a lot of people are just fixated on the arbitrage. Like, hey, I can borrow from this place at a low interest rate, and I'm going to just simply put that money into something that pays more than what I'm borrowing. Boom, I'm an investor now. And I am, making money hand over fist. And that's just a very beginner level understanding of what investment is. Do you agree with me on that one?
I'm laughing because I know where you're coming. I completely know where you're coming from. Yeah, I do. It just goes to show that investing is not just math. You cannot take the concept of investing and take out the psychology of it. So Morgan Housel has a book that I highly recommend everybody reads, The Psychology of Money. That book talks about so many concepts that money is what we chase. Money is what we're after, specifically when we're talking about investing. But all these unseen, you can see a dollar, you can see your bank account, but there's all these unseen circumstances and unseen variables that are in play. And the sooner you can identify all those unseen variables and also identify how you respond to those unseen variables, the easier it is to not only make more money, but spend more money and enjoy what money can bring. And the reason why I bring this up is because it takes a lot of introspection as a person to understand your relationship with money. Second book I would recommend, Mind Over Money, because it talks about your relationship growing up with money. So when we're 3, 4, 5 years old and up until the age of maybe 15, we don't really have much control of money. We just hear what our parents talk about. So if your parents are consistently talking every week about, hey, we need to do the budget, or hey, we're not going to have enough money for groceries next week. Well, you learn money is scarce. And then parents will tend to do this, like, oh, if you save money here, you'll get this treat. Or, hey, we're not gonna go out and buy this toy because we don't have the money. Well, then you think, well, when I grow up, I'm gonna make money so I can buy that toy. But you have to understand that those behaviors are not predetermined, but you can't only control so much as a young child. But the moment you get into adulthood and as you start realizing, understand that your relationship with money is based off of what your childhood was. And that's really with anything. When you go into relationships, when you start dating, when you go into the work environment, a lot of that is nature versus nurture. Our genetics, what we're brought up, what we're born with, and our nurture of what we're brought up with. And so the sooner you can identify that and ask yourself some questions of, do I believe money is scarce? Asking, what is my relationship with money? Why do I want to make this much money? The sooner you can do that, the sooner you don't have to go chasing after these big, crazy investments. And also you can discuss with your partner, because if they have a different money mindset than you do, well, then you have to have a happy medium. As I mentioned earlier, if you're more aggressive and they're more conservative, in my opinion, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is understanding, why are they so conservative and why am I so aggressive? Once you can understand that and have that communication and have that understanding, then you both understand each other. And when something goes bad, you know that you guys are both in it together, and you know how the loss is going to affect both of you, both individually, but also collectively.
I almost feel like, listening to you, I almost feel like for couples who are, it's the earlier you can start talking about your money or your experience and your not just your dreams and goals as a couple, but the earlier that topic can be openly discussed, the better off you're going to be and the stronger relationship you're going to have, right? Because if you wait till after you get married to find out, like, one is a spender and one is not, and then it just can get really, really kind of ugly. So yeah, while you were talking about that, kind of brought up, like, when is a good time to talk about, like, hey, it's a delicate topic. I get it, right? And we're trained not to talk about that early on in any type of setting. So it is a challenge.
I'm going to diverge here for a little bit. You asked the question, when is an appropriate time to talk about it? I think it's as soon as if you bring it up on a first date, And this doesn't have to be in a romantic setting. It could be with a friend. If you bring up money the first date or the first time you're hanging out with a friend and they get uncomfortable, that says a lot. Now, it's not to say that they're a bad person. It's not to say that they're you immediately should get away from them. But if you bring up money and their reaction isn't why do you bring that up? If they're not willing to have the discussion, to me, that is a red flag. And I know this isn't a dating podcast, but I think it's because we're on the topic of losing money. We're on the topic of how to have these conversations. Well, that all goes back to day one, because no matter if you've been with somebody for a month or for a decade or for 20 years, it doesn't matter. It all goes back to day one, because just like money compounds, so do relationships. Just like if you keep something swept under the rug, there's a time loss associated with not talking about it. Every day that goes by that you don't talk about the fear of that unknown is time that's away. Versus if you just put it out in the open and discuss it and learn it, you can build on it. And if there's things that need to be changed and adapted, you're catching it early on to either A, say, this person maybe isn't the right person for me, or B, hey, this person has characteristics that maybe I want to employ in myself. And you just start asking questions and asking questions. Because you're right, it is a taboo topic when we're talking about meeting new people and with our friend circles, because we tend to meet friends of friends who are in the general, world that we are in. It tends to be a little bit easier, but I can understand how difficult that could be. And you could just see people's associations with money if you just ask. And once you start asking those questions, you'd be surprised how much you can actually learn from them and then start implementing.
And I think when we're asking a question, we're not asking just like, hey, how much do you make per month? That's not the type of question I'm asking. I think the question I'm thinking in my mind would be more like, when was the last time somebody asked you about what's your relationship with money?
It goes back to, remember that question I told you about from 4,000 Weeks about, if someone gives you $1 million right now, what do you do with it? That's an icebreaker. Yeah, it's an icebreaker and it's an easy one. That's a big question that, to me, you can learn a lot about somebody by asking that question. It has nothing to do with, they could be making $20,000 a year or $2 million a year. That question, because $1 million, and we talked about this on our previous episode, the value of a dollar, right? If I'm making $1 million a year and you're making $50,000 a year and lunch is $15 average at a place, well, that $15 isn't going to have much of an impact. So $1 million is $1 million, and $1 million can buy certain things. How somebody answers that question can really tell you a lot. Or the question of, what's your relationship with money? I can guarantee you most people, I struggle with even answering this question. And I've asked myself this question time and time again. But most people will sit there and say, I honestly, like, where do I even start? Like, what kind of question is that to begin with?
They're never coming back to my house anymore.
They're turning off this podcast. Like, no, but it's true. I think it's very true, because as a person, when you ask a question to somebody, what are they going to do? They're going to answer the question. They're going to turn around and say, what about you? And there's been times I like, when I told you, I asked my wife about that $1 million question, she turned around on me and I was like, don't ask me that question. I wasn't asking me, I was asking you, because I don't know the answer, and oftentimes that's the case, but it makes you have to ask yourself, because if you have a significant other, your significant other is they're not going to just take I don't know. They're going to force you. They're going to challenge you, because they're going to make you a better person. And by making you a better person, you've had this question early on. So when the time comes about, merging bank accounts, and maybe you're talking about spending money on a trip, and then the next step is talking about saving, and then the next step is talking about investing. Well, throughout all of those cycles and all of those journeys, you've had those discussions. So by the time you come to investing, it's just another discussion. And the concept of losing money or an investment going south, it just becomes another discussion, as opposed to it being, oh my goodness, this is a life-altering event and I'm afraid how my spouse is going to take it.
Yeah. It's about normalizing that conversation, not just with spouse, but also with kids, right? With friends even. Because I remember one of the questions that you had, we actually read a book, Money Hacks. I think that was the title of the book. And one of the questions, right from the earlier chapter, was just like, it's kind of similar to that. What would you do with $1 million? But it was asking, if you have like a week or a very short period of time to spend $1 million, and that money that you spent cannot be buying another investment, what would you do with that money, right? How would you spend that? Whatever that answer is from your friend or from your associates or your spouse, that's a conversation starter right there. Like, what would they spend that money on, right? It says a lot.
And I also think that answer changes because as I remember that book, just for those listening, it's Money Hacks by Larry Steinhaus. Very interesting book. It was, I remember reading that book and we actually took some concepts away from it, such as the one by, what's it called? The one by lease, the car lease, which I think we kind of implemented ourselves. But what I learned from that is that things change. Like when I asked myself that question the first time, this was maybe a year ago, that answer changed from when it was 6 months ago. And just hearing you ask that question right now, again, my answer has changed because now I start thinking, crap, I hope Pei doesn't ask me. I hope Pei doesn't ask me the question because it's true. Because I know that things will change. And since we're on the topic, I know our listeners will get upset if we don't answer that question. So what would we do if we had $1 million right now? Well, for me at my current stage, I would more than likely pay off debt, just kind of clean things up. I would definitely use a lot of it to travel and probably end up buying real estate in other countries or other states that I could own. And eventually, turn into, I know we can't turn it into investment, but I would eventually turn it into investment or an Airbnb that I can personally use, and just continue to buy back my time. Something that I've talked about on this podcast multiple times. And I would continue to just find every little thing in my house or in my life or in my orbit of world that I can just pay somebody to do to just free up time. I know it's a little bit vague, but
well, then the question would be, what would you do with that extra time that you freed up?
Well, that's
next episode.
That's the next episode. Maybe not the next one. But for people listening right now, you can see how it's not uncomfortable because Pei and I have these conversations all the time. It's not uncomfortable, but internally it is like, I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. But the more I can force myself to ask that question of myself, step one, always ask the question of yourself. Then ask the question of others. Immediate circle first. Then you have that conversation with them why you guys came to that conclusion. And I'm telling you right now, it makes investing so much easier and so much more fun just because you already know, okay, well, if we both love traveling and our barrier right now to traveling is money, well, okay, if we invest and make more money, well, we can then go travel more. Well, that's something we both want to do. Understanding that, yes, that we both know going into it, there might be some risk and maybe we don't get to travel as soon as we would like to, but we're building towards something and it makes going to work more pleasurable because you're building towards something. I had a conversation with a buddy the other day and I firmly believe the chase is easier than the arrival. The grind is easier than the arrival because you're building and you're building and you're building towards something day in and day out. You don't think about it. You're just doing and you're building. And it makes the journey more pleasurable by doing that than having to get there. And there's going to be bumps along the way. There will be bumps along the way. And one of those bumps is what we're talking about right now is potentially a loss or underperformance of what you expected.
Right. Unexpectedness, things that happen along the way. But that's what, Chris Pei, that we interviewed, he mentioned, what is it? Happiness is actually that pursuit, the period of the pursuit. That's when we actually feel the happiest, right? Once you arrived, if you don't have the next thing that you're going after or pursuing, then there's tend to be a period of like maybe being unsettled or whatnot because you're so used to that. I mean, which is fine. Actually, sometimes a disruption or interruption is not a setback, right? It's like a ball. You're going just down this path. You got your blinders on and you're not thinking about anything else that's happening. And then something else happened and changed the trajectory. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because we always think of change as bad, but it's not necessarily bad, right? Because that change can actually change you and pivot you to something else that you don't even know exists yet. Actually, Mike and I were just talking today about how, I think it was Nelson who said this, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says something like, as the circle of our knowledge increase, right, the circumference of our the unknown gets bigger, something like that, right? So as we get more and more knowledgeable, we actually start to realize how much you don't know.
Yep. That's the curse of personal development, just in general, because you start going down that rabbit hole and you realize that you will never know everything. When you're first starting out and you learn something, you think you know everything. But then when you start knowing more, you realize I don't know anything. You think you know, at first you think you know 90% of a topic, and then you learn a little bit more, then you realize I only know 5 to 10% of this full topic because there's so much more out there. And I think something I just wanted to finish up on, because you mentioned the change aspect. And when something bad happens, by nature, we're calling it bad, but we don't necessarily need to call it bad. Yes, I think everybody would agree that losing money is not pleasurable. It's not enjoyable. Nobody wants to lose money. I go back to the book that I mentioned in, I think, a couple episodes ago, called Fluke, by Brian Klaas. And he talks about how we tend to view the world in a lens that's everything happens for a reason, right? That's typically what people tend to think about. But when you look back through history, we realize that there's little tiny things that happen that rewrite the whole course of history. And we don't even know it, because at the moment, or at the time that it happens, we can't see the alternate reality. We can't see what would have happened had this thing not happened. What I'm trying to implement more and more now, and as I am reading this and as I'm learning about things going on, I've noticed that as a result of losing money, because we're on this topic, but also just in general, bad things happening, it forces me to pivot to something else. And then a few months down the road, I end up achieving or doing something that I never would have done had I not had that failure 6 steps back. And I can trace it back to that single origin. I can trace it back to that single point. And to me, that allows me to have a semblance of gratitude, because I trace that back and I think, man, at the time, that was the worst thing that could have happened to me, because in my mind, I was set up for this trajectory and I was going to go there fast. But little did I know that key point caused me to move this way, and I ended up going on a higher trajectory. And I don't know otherwise. I don't know if this trajectory would have taken me. I projected it, but a projected reality is not actual reality. Maybe the loss of the $10,000 investment prevented me from losing $100,000. Because if I kept getting lucky and I made 10,000 and I made 20,000, then I made 30, and then I really doubled down and then I put 100 all in, well, I would have rather learned the lesson at 10,000 than learn the lesson at 100,000.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost like same thing for athletes, right? When an injury, we high school athletes or whatever, when an injury happens for a kid who's got a great career trajectory in whatever sports they're playing, at the time, it could be just devastating, right? But if you really look at a person's whole lifetime, right? Maybe this person, because not being able to play whatever sports that they were, football or whatever, they ended up pivoting and then going to a school that inspired them, and then or started a business that inspired them, and they become hugely successful in that other path, right? So when you really come back and say, like, did that bad thing was it really that bad? Yeah, at the time it was, but had that bad thing didn't happen, they wouldn't be on the other path.
You basically just summed up my journey. It was being a high school athlete. I was destined to go to college, play soccer, go into the Major League Soccer. That was my plan, was to play in Europe eventually, make good money, be a professional soccer player. Got injured, broke that little tiny bone in your ankle. It's called a talus bone. It just shattered and just caused so many recurring issues, ligament damage, just a bunch of different things. And as a result of that, I remember I had a plan to go play D1 soccer and I didn't. Ended up at community college. And it was in that community college that I was all down on myself. First class I took, exercise class. That exercise class then had me asking questions. Oh, that was pretty interesting. Then that exercise class led to a nutrition class. That nutrition class led to me pursuing a career in the field of nutrition as dietetics, as a dietitian. And boom, from there, became a dietitian, spent my time there as a dietitian, wanted to make more money, ended up as an investor. I mean, you summed up, like, you pretty much summed up my whole life. And I see friends of mine, people who were better soccer players than me, who are currently playing and living the life that I thought I wanted, making less money and with way more stress than I currently have. And I think, like, that's literally what I wanted. I see people who have everything that I wanted at the time. And then I see what I have and I think, man, it almost makes me sad, because I almost want to go back to tell myself at 12, 13, 14, 15, listen, this is going to be the best thing for you in your life. I want people to take that example and just take what you had said, wrap that in, because there's so much that can be said of making the most out of anything that happens, be it a loss of a job, a loss of an investment, even something as not as significant, just a little, you had a bad day, you didn't sleep well. Well, maybe the fact that you didn't sleep well caused you to be late for work, and the bus you missed or the accident you missed could have saved your life, or there's so many contingency things that could go in different directions that you don't know. So trying to make the most of it, I think it's just so important for where we're at right now, just not only you and me personally, but for others listening. I think this is such an important episode. I'm hoping that people will understand that whether or not you've experienced this, take it from people who have, that it will happen, maybe hopefully to a smaller scale than it has to us or to other people, but it will happen. And it's at that point that you'll value and realize how important it is to have your significant other, your spouse, and your close inner circle with you to help get you through that.
Yeah. And I think a piece of that is we have to, anybody who's wanting to get into investment or have started to dabble in it, and you keep having wins, you have to realize that investment, if you haven't lost money in investment, perhaps you haven't invested. I hate to say it, right? Celebrate the success. I'm not, cursing anybody, to have failed investments. I'm just telling you like it is, right? If you only have wins, there's a loss on its way coming to you. I'm just saying, but embrace the losses. It's okay. Celebrate the wins, and don't be paralyzed. The worst thing you can do is to not do anything and just kind of retreat back, right? Especially if you're an investor, the best thing to do is to kind of like really pick yourself up, find a way to pivot and turn around and move forward. That's the best way to get over a failed relationship, right? It's the best way to, if you get fired from your job, yes, you feel bad about it, you go home, you're upset, but don't just sit there and not send out resumes, right? You go back in there, and that's how you overcome that challenge, right? You fall off the horse, happens, get right back on, right? Of course, you spend maybe a little bit of time to like recover from your injury and whatnot, but
I couldn't agree more. And there's a spiritual component to it, whether or not you're religious or not. There's a spiritual thing to be said about trusting your gut and trusting the process. Almost that it's almost liberating to feel that not everything is in your control, right? Because then if you can take it that like, okay, all the good isn't really as good and all the bad really isn't as bad, because there's all these external forces going on around you that you cannot control. It takes a weight off your shoulders, because if you really and truly determined every single outcome from your life, then therefore you are responsible for the every success and every failure. And that is one hell of a roller coaster ride. It really is. And I think I know I used to view my life that way, and I'm trying to pivot towards the way of understanding that there's so much outside of our control, and it does take a little bit of weight off your shoulders. So I know that this has been a little bit of a loaded episode. I know we kind of threw a lot out there, and we're not trying to be pessimistic. We're not trying to paint a negative image of what's out there and to be scared, but we on this podcast are aiming to just have that open discussion and let people know of all the wins. And we've shared wins, we've shared things that have gone well, and we want people to know that there's two sides to that same coin. There are losses, there's agony in there, and that meme that says what people think success will look like, and it's just a straight arrow, right? And then it's like what success actually looks like, and it's like this, right? But you're still going up and up and up. And I think that part is very enjoyable. And I appreciate your insight, right? Because I know your personality has taken you just all over the place and doing a bunch of different things, which is great.
Oh, trust me, I've failed a lot, right? But even with like the social media and whatnot, you only share the good things that happen, whatever. You're not going to be out there airing like all the dirty laundry. But I have always just felt like it's better to be transparent. If anybody asks me, what have you done and what worked, what didn't work, I'm always happy to share the success stories and all the dumb things that I've done, right? Those are wisdom along the way that I picked up. So that's the saying, right? The smart man learns from his own mistake. The wise one learns from somebody else's mistake. So hopefully by me, sharing the mistakes that we personally have done or that we've, seen others are doing or have done, it kind of helps to spread the word so that others don't do the same thing, right? Be wise and learn from others' mistake. That's all I'm saying.
Couldn't say it better myself. Well, Pei, I appreciate the insight, the wisdom, the knowledge that you've shared, and hopefully everybody's gotten some knowledge as well from here today. And